There is a moment, in the wild, when something deeply strange happens. When the rules that govern survival are broken, not once, but many times over. And the result is something that shouldn't exist, something biology never intended. This is a story that takes place in the flat, sun-scorched thornbush country of southern Africa, where the red dust hangs in the air long after a herd has passed, where the mornings are so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat, and where, over the course of a single dry season, a pack of African wild dogs did something that no field researcher had ever fully documented before. They accepted a spotted hyena into their ranks. They fed with it, moved with it, rested beside it. And then, one afternoon, everything changed. If you want to understand how something like that is even possible, you need to start at the beginning, not just of this particular story, but of the animals at the heart of it. Because the African wild dog and the spotted hyena are two of the most misunderstood, most underestimated, and most extraordinary animals on this entire continent. And to understand why they were ever drawn together, you first need to understand what each of them is, and what each of them carries. Stay with us until the end of this, because the way this story finishes is not the way you expect it to. And if you are new here, now is the time to subscribe. Hit that button before the story pulls you under, because once it does, you are not going to want to stop. The African wild dog is not a wolf. It is not related to the domestic dog in any meaningful direct sense. It belongs to its own genus, Lycaon, and the full name, Lycaon pictus, translates roughly as painted wolf. When you look at one for the first time, the name makes sense. Each individual is unique, a living canvas of black and amber and white and cream, blotched and swirled in patterns that are as distinctive as a human fingerprint. No two are the same. They have enormous round ears, almost comically large for the size of the head, which they use to communicate with the kind of subtle precision that most animals can only dream about. They have only 4 toes on each foot, not 5, which makes them anatomically different from nearly every other canid on Earth. And they run. That is what a wild dog does better than almost anything alive. It runs. A cheetah is faster across the ground, but a cheetah tires within 400 meters. A lion is stronger, but a lion gives up a chase if it does not pay off quickly. A wild dog does not give up. It is built around endurance in a way that is almost unsettling to watch. A pack will chase prey for 5 kilometers, for 8 kilometers, for 12 if necessary, rotating the lead runner, managing the pace like trained athletes, never overcommitting, never panicking, simply following and following until the animal being chased runs out of world to run through. Their success rate is extraordinary. Estimates vary depending on terrain and prey, but the figures that come out of long-term studies are consistently high. In open country with good sight lines, wild dogs kill somewhere between 70 and 80% of the animals they chase. Lions manage roughly a quarter of that on a good day. This is what it means to be built for the hunt. Not strength, not ambush, not claws or crushing weight, just the capacity to run until the prey cannot run anymore. But hunting success is only part of what makes wild dogs remarkable. What truly separates them from most other predators on the continent is the way they live together. Wild dog packs are not dominance hierarchies in the traditional sense. They are not like wolf packs, where a rigid chain of command governs every interaction. The structure is more fluid, more democratic. A breeding pair typically sits at the core of a pack, but the bonds that hold the group together are not built on fear or submission. They are built on what can really only be called devotion. When the pack returns from a hunt, dogs that stayed behind at the den site rush forward to greet the returning hunters with what can only be described as joy. Tails wagging, bodies twisting, faces pressed together. And then the hunters regurgitate food, not just for the pups, but for any adult that did not get to the kill. Any injured dog, any lactating female, any individual that needed to stay behind for any reason at all, is fed from the bodies of those who ran. This is not incidental. This is the core of wild dog society. The pack is the survival unit. The individual is nothing without it. And the pack, in turn, sacrifices individual interests constantly to sustain the whole. Pups are raised collectively. Multiple adults will babysit, guard, feed, and play with puppies that are not their own. When a pack is healthy and large, survival rates for pups are high. When a pack shrinks below a critical size, the whole enterprise begins to unravel. You need enough hunters to run effective relays. You need enough babysitters to keep the pups safe. You need enough eyes scanning the landscape to keep the lions and the hyenas from simply taking everything you worked for. And that brings us to the other animal at the center of this story, the spotted hyena. Spotted hyenas are perhaps the single most misrepresented predator in Africa. The myths around them are dense and old and almost entirely wrong. They are not scavengers. They are one of the most effective hunters on the continent. They are not cowardly. They are bold to the point of recklessness, capable of mobbing lions, displacing leopards from kills, and facing down threats that most animals would flee from without hesitation. They are not stupid. They have the largest brain-to-body ratio of any African carnivore, and their problem-solving abilities in controlled experiments have matched and sometimes exceeded those of primates. The spotted hyena belongs to a family called Hyenidae, and it is more closely related to civets and mongooses than it is to dogs or cats. Its physical adaptations are extraordinary. The jaws of a spotted hyena generate the highest bite force relative to body size of any land predator on Earth. They can crush bone that would defeat a lion. Their digestive systems process material that would simply be indigestible to almost any other animal. The white chalky scat that hyenas leave behind is largely calcium from the bones they have completely dissolved and passed through their bodies. Nothing is wasted, nothing is left behind. A spotted hyena clan is a female-dominated society. This is rare among mammals. The females are larger than the males, they hold social rank that passes down through matrilineal lines, and the entire social architecture of the clan revolves around the dominant female and her female relatives. Males in a hyena clan are often peripheral, frequently low-ranking, and regularly excluded from kills by the females and even by cubs that outrank them by virtue of their mother's position. Hyena clans maintain territories, sometimes enormous ones stretching across many kilometers of landscape, and they defend these territories with noise and with aggression. The whoops and giggles and the long rising calls that carry through the night are not random. They are clan communications, territorial advertisements, rally signals, the sound of a society organizing itself in the dark. Now place these two animals in the same landscape. Put a wild dog pack and a spotted hyena clan in overlapping territories and watch what happens. What usually happens is conflict. Hyenas follow wild dogs. This is one of the most consistently documented behaviors in African predator ecology. Hyenas, particularly lone individuals or small groups, will trail a wild dog pack and wait for the dogs to make a kill. Then they will move in. A single hyena will displace an entire wild dog pack from a fresh kill. The dogs will harass it, will dart and nip and drive it in circles, but the hyena simply absorbs the punishment and keeps eating. It is too large to damage and too stubborn to scare. The dogs eventually retreat to the edges, catching whatever scraps they can around the margins of something that was theirs. This is the relationship. This is the baseline. Hyenas take from wild dogs. Wild dogs flee hyenas. This is the way it works. Or it was, until it didn't. The dry season in the Limpopo Basin is a slow kind of catastrophe. The rivers pull back from their banks in stages, leaving cracked mud and bleached stone. The grasses dry from green to yellow to the color of old paper. The trees hold onto their leaves for as long as possible and then release them in slow drifts that the wind takes away. What had been a complex, layered landscape becomes simpler, harder, more exposed. Prey animals cluster around the remaining water sources, and the predators cluster around the prey. In this particular area, a wild dog pack had established itself in and around a stretch of mixed thorn bush and open floodplain. The pack numbered 11 adults and 7 pups, which was by most measures a successful and healthy group. The breeding female was an experienced animal, several years old, with obvious scarring across one flank that had been with her for at least 2 seasons. The pack had been tracked and observed by researchers attached to a long-running carnivore monitoring program, and the data on their movements, their hunting patterns, their territory, and their interspecies interactions was detailed and consistent. Sometime in the early weeks of the dry season, a juvenile spotted hyena began appearing in the vicinity of the pack. The word juvenile is worth dwelling on. This was not a fully grown adult. It was a young animal, probably between 1 and 2 years old, still carrying some of the darker juvenile coloring that spotted hyenas gradually lose as they mature. It was on its own. There was no sign of a clan association. No other hyenas accompanied it. When researchers attempted to place it within the known clan territories in the surrounding area, they could not confidently assign it to any of the established groups. A lone hyena is a rare and precarious thing. Spotted hyenas are social animals. Their survival depends on clan membership in much the same way that wild dog survival depends on pack membership. A lone hyena cannot compete at kills with established clans. It cannot defend a territory. It cannot find a mate within a functioning social structure. It is, in biological terms, a creature without a context. There are various ways a hyena might find itself in this position. It may have been pushed out during a period of clan instability. It may have lost its mother at a young age and failed to establish the necessary social connections before being expelled, or simply drifting. It may have been born into a clan that was itself weakened or destroyed. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. This young animal was alone in a landscape that punishes solitude, and it found the wild dogs. The first documented contact was, predictably, antagonistic. The hyena approached a kill site where the pack had just brought down an impala. The dogs reacted as they always do, mobbing the intruder with coordinated dashes, filling the air with high-pitched alarm calls, driving it away from the carcass. The hyena retreated, but it did not go far. It sat at the edge of the action and watched. Over the following days, it kept appearing, always at a distance, always watching. The dogs reacted each time, but with slightly less intensity. There was something about the animal's behavior that was different from the usual hyena intrusion. It was not asserting itself. It was not pushing toward the kill. It was simply present, and it was behaving with what could only be described as deference. This is an unusual word to apply to a spotted hyena, but it fits. Gradually, by increments too small to measure in real time, but unmistakable in the data over days and then weeks, the distance between the hyena and the pack began to close. The dog's alarm responses became shorter, less coordinated, and eventually almost routine rather than genuine. The younger dogs began approaching the hyena more out of curiosity than aggression. There was sniffing. There was the cautious, stiff-legged investigation that canids perform when assessing something unfamiliar. There was, in one observation that researchers noted, with visible surprise in their field notes, what appeared to be play behavior between two juvenile wild dogs and the young hyena. Short chases, quick retreats, a circling that had none of the tension of a real confrontation. By the middle of the dry season, the hyena was moving with the pack. Not always. Not every day. There were gaps of several days when it disappeared entirely, and researchers speculated it was ranging independently, perhaps following other opportunities or simply maintaining some degree of autonomy. But it returned, consistently, and when it was present, it occupied a specific social position within the pack's movements that was neither integrated nor excluded. It was something in between. It was tolerated. Given what we know about both species, that word carries enormous weight. The question that the researchers kept returning to was why. Why would a wild dog pack tolerate a spotted hyena in its midst? And why would a hyena, with all the advantages of size and jaw strength and individual boldness, choose a submissive posture rather than attempting to exploit the pack's resources by force? The answers, as they developed over observation after observation, were not simple, but they were remarkable. For the hyena, the logic is easier to construct. A young, clanless individual, in a landscape where established hyena clans hold territory, faces a set of risks that are genuinely life-threatening. Moving through another clan's territory invites attack. A healthy adult hyena clan will kill lone individuals that intrude, particularly low-ranking or young ones that cannot offer a meaningful alliance. Moving alone through lion country, without the protection of a social group, raises predation risk significantly. African lions will kill hyenas when the opportunity presents itself, and a single hyena, with no clan to call as backup, is a manageable target for a pride with hungry mouths. The wild dog pack offered something that the hyena needed more urgently than a meal. It offered a social context. It offered a group of warm bodies moving through the landscape with coordinated vigilance and a clear territory. The dogs were not as physically imposing as an adult hyena clan, but they were numerous, they were alert, and their presence in an area would not go unnoticed by the landscape's other predators. For the wild dogs, the calculation is harder to explain and harder to accept. Wild dogs lose too much to hyenas to extend anything that looks like tolerance without good reason. Every kilo of meat that a hyena takes is a kilo that does not go into a hunting dog or a pup. The energy budget of a wild dog pack is precise and relentless. They cannot afford waste. They run extraordinary distances every day. Their bodies burn through energy at rates that demand constant replenishment. Tolerating a hyena at the edges of the pack seems, on the surface, to make no biological sense. But there are a few possibilities that researchers worked through. The most compelling involves something that any prey animal on the African savanna could tell you without hesitation. The sound and scent of a hyena keeps other predators away. A leopard that might attempt to steal a wild dog kill in the night will be far more cautious if a hyena is present. A roaming male lion approaching a kill site will often turn back when he detects hyena presence without visual confirmation of numbers. The hyena's deterrent effect on other predators is powerful and well documented. A young wild dog pack with pups in the ground is acutely vulnerable. Pups die to lions. They die to leopards. They die to honey badgers and to pythons. Every additional layer of protection around the den site increases survival rates, and the smell of a hyena in residence is a more effective deterrent to most threats than almost any other signal the dogs could broadcast. There is also another possibility, one that is harder to quantify, but that experienced field researchers are willing to voice carefully. Wild dogs are extraordinarily social and extraordinarily observant. The young dogs in the pack had grown up observing this particular hyena in a context where it was not behaving as a threat. Young animals learn their world from what they experience, not solely from what instinct predicts. And juvenile wild dogs at play are not entirely unlike juvenile hyenas at play. Curiosity, energy, investigation. The behavioral languages are different, but the impulses overlap. By the time researchers had compiled 2 full months of data, the picture that emerged was unlike anything in the prior literature. A spotted hyena was sleeping within 30 meters of a wild dog den site. It was eating from kills that the dogs made, but only after the pack had fed, and usually from what remained rather than competing directly. It was reacting to alarm calls from the dogs with the same alert, scanning posture that the dogs themselves showed. And on at least 2 recorded occasions, it appeared to participate in the initial harassment of a lion that approached the pack's territory, not in the coordinated, selfless way that wild dogs mob threats together, but with the loud, aggressive vocalization and the circling that hyenas use to deter competitors from a site. There is a word researchers are cautious about using in ecology because it implies intention and direction that may not exist in any meaningful cognitive sense. But the word that kept appearing in the margins of field notes, the word that was crossed out and rewritten and then left in because nothing else quite fit, was alliance. Then the rains came early. Or rather, something happened that the rains would normally bring, but which arrived in the middle of the dry season through a different mechanism entirely. A large clan of spotted hyenas, displaced from their usual territory by a series of territorial battles with a rival clan further north, moved into the area. Not 1 or 2 individuals, a full clan, adults, subadults, juveniles, the established hierarchy of a functioning hyena society, with all the aggression and noise and territorial assertion that comes with it. The young lone hyena that had been living at the margins of the wild dog pack would have smelled them coming long before it saw them. Researchers tracked the clan's movements over several days and noted that their route brought them directly through the core of the wild dog pack's territory. The pack moved in response, as they always do when larger threats enter the space, compressing their movements around the den site, becoming quieter and more cautious, spending less time in exposed terrain. The lone hyena's behavior changed dramatically in this period. It became more restless. It moved in wider circles around the pack's position. On one occasion, a researcher observed it approaching the edge of the invading clan's resting site and then retreating without any apparent acknowledgement from the clan members. It was, in effect, attempting to make contact with its own kind, attempting to find a way back in, but a lone young hyena approaching an unfamiliar, established clan is not welcomed. It is assessed, and if it is found to offer nothing of social or genetic value to the dominant female, it is expelled or worse. The lone hyena was expelled. What happened next is the part of this story that has been revisited and discussed and argued over in the research community, with an intensity that suggests nobody is entirely comfortable with their own interpretation of it. The expelled hyena returned to the wild dog pack, quickly, within the same day. And this time it did not approach at a respectful distance. It moved into the pack's immediate space with a directness that had not been seen before. The dog's reaction was immediate and sharp. Several of the adult dogs rushed toward it with the full alarm response, the kind of reaction that had not appeared in weeks of observation. The hyena stood its ground in a way it had never done before in the pack's presence. There was a quality to the interaction that was different. The deference that had defined the hyena's behavior for months was gone. Not entirely, and not suddenly, but gone in a way that the dogs seemed to register immediately. Over the following 2 days, the interactions between the hyena and the pack underwent a shift that researchers described in their notes with careful, measured language, but which anyone reading those notes can see was something close to a collapse. The hyena began approaching kills before the pack had finished feeding. It was met with aggression, real aggression, not the routine harassment of weeks earlier, but the full, coordinated mobbing response of a pack defending food. It began sleeping closer to the den site than it had ever done before. The adult dogs began patrolling the immediate perimeter of the den more frequently, marking more aggressively, vocalizing in the dark in ways that suggested elevated stress. The pups, which had spent weeks occasionally approaching the hyena during resting periods, were now being actively kept away from it by the adult dogs. The boundary between tolerated and not tolerated, between accepted presence and threat, was being redrawn. Not by human observers, not by the logic of a written analysis, but by the dogs themselves, in real time, in the dust and heat of a dry season afternoon. The final break came on a day when researchers were conducting a standard movement survey. The pack was resting in broken shade, scattered loosely in the way wild dogs do when the heat is at its peak, and energy conservation takes priority over everything else. The hyena was approximately 20 meters from the nearest dog, lying flat in the way that hyenas rest, head down, hindquarters elevated slightly by the slope of the ground. One of the younger adult males in the pack, an animal that researchers had identified as particularly bold and which had previously been among the individuals most willing to approach the hyena, walked directly toward it. The hyena lifted its head. Its ears went back. There was a low sound. Then the male dog made a single sharp call that in wild dog communication is associated with the mobilization of the pack for a specific purpose. Not a hunt, not a lion alert, something more immediate. Every dog in the pack came to its feet. They moved toward the hyena together. What followed lasted less than 4 minutes. The pack drove the hyena across the open ground, not in the probing, harassing way of the early weeks, but with sustained, coordinated commitment. The lead dogs pushed from the front while others flanked the sides, reducing the hyena's options for turning. The hyena ran. It was not injured. Wild dogs are not built to kill something the size of a hyena, and they were not trying to. They were removing it. The hyena crossed a dry riverbed at the far edge of the pack's core territory and did not come back. Researchers continued monitoring the pack for the rest of the season and into the following year. The lone hyena was never documented in association with the pack again. What was left behind in the data was a record of something that asks hard questions about what we think we know about the rules that govern predator behavior. The story is sometimes told as a tale of rejection. The wild dogs took a hyena in and then drove it out. End of story. But that telling misses the most important part of what happened. It misses the arc. It misses the detail of what was learned over months of cohabitation and what was communicated in the moment of expulsion. The dogs did not reject the hyena because it was a hyena. If that were the case, no amount of submissive behavior would ever have been sufficient to cross the threshold from threat to tolerance. And yet tolerance was achieved. Achieved, sustained for months, and only withdrawn when specific behaviors changed. What the dogs responded to was not species, it was behavior. And when the behavior changed, the relationship changed. This is not a small thing to say. It challenges a framework in which predator-species interactions are governed by fixed templates, by hardwired responses that categorize members of other species into permanent categories of competitor, prey, or irrelevance. The wild dogs of this pack demonstrated something more flexible than that, more responsive to individual history and individual context. And the hyena, for its part, demonstrated something that is almost never credited to the species in popular understanding. It demonstrated the capacity to adopt a social strategy outside its own species framework. It suppressed behaviors that would have been adaptive in a hyena clan context, and adopted a set of postures and approaches that were legible to dogs. It learned, within the context of this pack, what it needed to do to remain. When the clan arrived and the expulsion failed, something shifted. Whether the hyena made a deliberate calculation, whether it was driven by desperation, whether the proximity of its own kind simply overwhelmed months of conditioned restraint, cannot be known. But the shift was real, and the dogs read it immediately. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson about the limits of cross-species tolerance, about the inevitability of the return to type, about how the rules of the wild cannot be indefinitely suspended, no matter how unusual the circumstances that create the deviation. But there is another version, one that is equally supported by the evidence and perhaps more honest about what the evidence actually shows. Two animals, both social, both highly intelligent, both built around the logic of group survival, found themselves in a context where the usual parameters of their relationship were disrupted. One was alone and needed a group. One had a group and could afford to extend its margins. They negotiated. Over weeks and months, they negotiated in the only language available to them, which was behavior, and they arrived at something that served both of them imperfectly, but sufficiently. It ended not because wild dogs and hyenas are incapable of coexistence. It ended because the context that had made coexistence useful changed. The hyena had options again, or thought it did. The dogs had reasons for caution again. The negotiation collapsed, not because it was never real, but because the conditions that made it productive had disappeared. In the Limpopo Basin, in the flat, dry country, where the thornbush throws thin shadows and the red dust settles on everything at dusk, that particular dry season passed. The rains came, the grasses returned, the rivers refilled their beds in stages, and the animals spread out again across the landscape. The wild dog pack raised 6 pups to independence from the litter that had been in the ground during the months of the hyenas association. That is a good result. That is above the average survival rate for pups in that area in that year. Whether the hyena's presence had any effect on that outcome is impossible to say with certainty. Researchers are careful about that, but they note it. The lone hyena was picked up in tracking data 3 times over the following season, always moving alone, always in transitional zones between established territories. Whether it ever found a clan to join, or whether it spent its days in that solitary condition that the data had first caught it in, cannot be said. It is the part of the story that remains open. The African wild dog is among the most endangered carnivores on the continent. There are fewer than 7,000 left in the wild. The causes of their decline are the same ones that have pressed on large African carnivores across the board. Habitat fragmentation, human-wildlife conflict, disease transmission from domestic animals. But wild dogs are also particularly vulnerable because of the very quality that makes them extraordinary. Their social structure is so tightly woven that any disruption to it tends to unravel the whole. A pack that loses its breeding female to a snare or a vehicle collision does not simply keep going. It falls apart. Individuals disperse. Pups starve. The whole intricate architecture of the group collapses because the architecture was built around relationships, and relationships cannot simply be replaced by the arrival of a new individual. This is why wild dog conservation efforts have had to move beyond protecting habitat and managing prey density. They have had to grapple with the social structure of the animal itself. Attempts to reintroduce wild dogs or to reinforce struggling packs have had mixed results for precisely this reason. The group dynamics are not straightforward. Pack members need to know each other. They need to have learned together, hunted together, grieved together, in whatever sense wild dogs grieve when a pack member does not return from a chase. You cannot simply assemble a pack from available individuals and expect it to function. The relationships take time to build. This is also why the story of the adopted hyena matters beyond its immediate strangeness, because it speaks to the capacity of wild dogs to build relationships across the lines that we assume are fixed. Their social sophistication is not merely an intra-species phenomenon. It reaches beyond the boundary of what we think of as their world. The spotted hyena is in a better position numerically than the wild dog. Approximately 30,000 individuals remain across sub-Saharan Africa, and in some areas the species is genuinely thriving. But spotted hyenas face pressures that are often invisible in the population data. Clan structure depends on territory, and territory depends on landscape. As land is converted to agriculture and settlements push into former wilderness, hyena clans are compressed, their territories reduced, and the social dynamics that keep clan life functional are put under strain. Conflict increases. Young animals are expelled earlier or under more dangerous conditions. The kind of solitary young individual that appeared at the margins of the wild dog pack in the Limpopo is not an anomaly produced by unusual circumstances. It is increasingly a predictable product of a landscape under pressure. What happened in the Limpopo dry season is, in one sense, a singular event, unusual enough that the researchers who documented it have published it and talked about it and argued over its implications. But in another sense, it is also a signal. It is the landscape producing animals that cannot find their usual social context and must improvise. It is social structures under pressure bending in directions that nobody predicted. In the long arc of African predator ecology, adaptation has always been the mechanism of survival. The animals that are still here are here,